Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. From Shore to Shore is a play written by British playwright Mary Cooper in collaboration with M.W. Sun, based on real migration stories from Chinese communities throughout the UK, that is about to tour nationally. The performances will take place in Chinese restaurants and Chinese community centres rather than in theatres, beginning at the Yang Sing in Manchester's Chinatown in March 2019. A couple of weeks before the production was due to open, I met with the play's director, David Tse, and veteran British-Chinese actor Ozzie Yue, who leads the cast, at the Royal Exchange Theatre's rehearsal rooms in Manchester, and I asked David to explain what the play is about.
It's the story of how the British-Chinese community arrived, or at least three characters, how they arrived in Leeds and Yorkshire, in the UK, basically. It's symbolic of people moving from one country to another, travelling from shore to shore, hence the name.
Yes.
And the play was created when Mary Cooper, the writer, in association with M.W. Sun, who's a Chinese writer, the two of them interviewed the British-Chinese community in Leeds and Yorkshire over the course of 2 to 3 years. And from their interviews, they distilled all these wonderful stories of real people's lives, and they decided to fashion a play out of some of these fantastic stories. And so you're getting a real insight into a community that's living amongst you, people who are British, who also happen to be Chinese, but these three main characters are all not born here. One is born here, then she's sent back to Hong Kong as a baby to be brought up by her grandmother, then she comes back as a child of 7 and grows up in Leeds in a takeaway. But you're getting a real insight into members of the British Chinese community that people don't normally hear about. So I think that's what the piece is. It's the lives and experiences, the ups and downs, the loves, the tragedies, the family relationships, particularly, I think, amongst the characters. So you get a real insight into their common humanity.
So, okay, that was a good introduction. It's about some of the Chinese communities at different parts of the country, but now you're opening here in Manchester, right in the heart of Chinatown, which is a big Chinese community, a very well-known Chinese community as well. So why did you decide to have the big opening in Manchester?
As I say, the stories were gathered from the British Chinese community in Leeds and Yorkshire, but actually what the writers have cleverly done is they've distilled the essence. There were common themes, say from the older generation, and their experiences, whether they'd come over from Hong Kong or from China, but their experience during the war, for example, with the Japanese, or other experiences of deciding to leave China or Hong Kong and coming to work in catering in the UK. So those common themes the writers distilled and then amalgamated and put into the character of Cheung Wing, played by Ozzie Yue. And then there was another theme amongst sort of certain middle-aged women of perhaps difficulties with their family, with their parents. And that has been distilled and put into the character of Mei Lan, who is British-born. Of the three main characters, she's the one that's British-born, but, sent back to be reared by her grandmother because her parents are busy in catering, and then she comes back as a child and she works in the family takeaway. So, this kind of distillation of different experiences. So Cheung Wing is born in China, he moves to Hong Kong, then he moves to Liverpool, and then eventually to Leeds. Mei Lan is born in Leeds, goes to Hong Kong, eventually comes back to Leeds, is sent to the Dales in Yorkshire for a period, and then eventually runs a takeaway in Yorkshire. And the last one, Yi Di, so the first two characters are connected to catering, but the third character, Yi Di, is from mainland China. She's younger. She comes over to the UK when she's 28 to do a PhD, and she represents the younger generation of mainland Chinese coming over who are now professionals or academics. So there's a very different facets to these different strands of the Chinese community from a pensioner to middle age to younger.
It looks at the different outlooks they've got on life here in the UK based on the past experiences, really. For instance, my character, which I'm a sort of patriarch of the play to some extent, because I have lived through everything from sort of the Japanese of the war, the times when it was nationalists and communists were having problems, and then all that trauma of actually being able to get from where you are in sort of mainland China and then to Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong to come to the UK, and the trials and tribulations to get that. And it just doesn't, not like today, if you just go down to the embassy, get a visa and come straight up. You couldn't do that. You had to do things by underhand methods to some extent. And so that's my story more. And I think probably, and I'm right, the academia side of it. My son, when I come over here, becomes an academic. He doesn't go into the catering business like I did when I first started. So that's where the academia side of it comes into it. So, and he was born here in the UK, but has never had that experience of having the Chinese culture the same way as Mei Lan has, who I've actually taken on as my goddaughter, really, and that's the person, the girl who got sent back to live with her grandmother in Hong Kong. He didn't get anything like that. The one thing people do want when they come over from and been over here for a while, if they have children, they want them to be well educated because of the experience that they've had in China and through their lives, where sometimes they were denied an education, not necessarily by the government, but by circumstances and the things that happened around them.
And then Yidi comes full circle because she's of that generation who's very educated, comes from a middle-class family. So the element of class really runs through the piece as well. So, Cheung Wing is from definitely a working-class family, as is Mei Lan, the lady from the most dysfunctional family of all, and you hear problems of her father drinking, her mother gambling. So it's all these kind of terrible stories which could affect anybody. They're not specific to the Chinese community, but when you're also an immigrant and you're dealing with racism at school, for example, which Mei Lan also faces, then having an unstable family background creates a lot more complications for her, a lot more drama. And really, I guess the piece at the end of the day is accessible and relevant to anybody because it's about family. It's about love. It's about the sacrifices that the older generation makes for the younger, or the pressure they put on the younger, and how the younger generation responds to that. And those are kind of universal themes. And this idea of, from shore to shore, it's not just about foreigners. It's actually about, say you were white and you were born in a small little market town, and then, you go to university perhaps, or not, and then you move to a big city. That, in a sense, is also a kind of a more metaphorical from shore to shore. It's about how people change over the years. And so the stories are very full for the three characters, and there's humour, there's some comedy there, but there are also some very moving moments.
It sounds though, even though this is somebody else's script and you're acting in it, it sounds like there's a lot that's very close to home, certainly for you, Ozzie. Have you both found that?
Well, I was born here. I was born in Liverpool. Which in Manchester, I suppose, is a bad thing. Well, but having said that, when you consider it, the Liverpool Chinese community is the oldest Chinese community in Europe. And the Manchester Chinese community wouldn't have developed had it not been for Liverpool, because basically initially what happened was that Liverpool became sort of a little bit crowded to some extent. So people said, we'll we'll go look further afield.
Go down the canal a bit.
So they said, we'll just go down the East Lancs. And said, oh, there's a nice place to set up a Chinese restaurant.
Yeah.
So and that's how the Chinese community developed in Manchester, and likewise in everywhere else. The two oldest Chinese communities in the UK are in Cardiff and Liverpool, not London. London, everybody seems to think of Sherlock Holmes and Limehouse and things like that. Yeah. But no, it was nothing like that. Came after the Liverpool, because in China, when people decided to come to the UK, they thought, there's famine here. Farmers would said, we'll go work on a ship. Where can we go on a ship? Just go take a ship. So that the ships were going one or two ways. They either went east to the US, and there they ended up in either Vancouver or San Francisco, right? Or they came west to Europe and England, and they'd either end up, ships didn't go to London then, they either went to Liverpool or Cardiff, and that's how it is. And when they got off, they said, right, let's get off here.
Yes.
And they said, let's set up. So they set up little businesses and things like that.
Yeah. Like you say, it's not, maybe not universal, but it's the migrant experience. And some of the things that you were saying, it's like the cliches of different migrant communities, not just the Chinese, like the Jewish migrants or the Asian migrants, where there's a certain business that they specialise in, and the generation moves here wants their children to be well educated, become lawyers and doctors and things like that. Yeah. All those cliches, they always apply to those migrant communities.
I think so, and I think even perhaps Anglo-Saxons and when in the past when
the French lace workers in the 16th century,
the French Huguenots and all the other white communities that moved over from Europe, probably similar. If you're from a poorer background, education is a means of escape.
Yes.
I mean, even our writer, Mary Cooper, she said that was very much her family's experience. She comes from a working class background, and for her, the guidance she got from her parents, and especially her father, she mentioned, was that education was a way to improve their lives. And I think that's always been the case amongst the different classes, and that is why political movements have different emphases regarding education, but it is a way to enable people to escape the circumstances that they might be born in. You have more options usually, the more education you get, and this features very strongly in the play. Especially young Cheng Wing.
My family, my actual family, were the same. My grandfather came here originally a long time, sort of early 1900s, just probably around about the time of the First World War, and he set up a laundry business in Liverpool. And then he sent for my father, sort of in the 20s, when my father was literally about 16, 17.
Yeah.
And he came over with his brother, so we managed to get him over. And you were saying about the Jewish community, and one of my father's first affiliations was with the Jewish community. One of the first jobs he got was working for the Jewish bakery. Right. He learned to drive, delivering bagels for the local Jewish bakery in Liverpool. And when you're talking about this sort of story we're talking about the conflict and everything that's happening in China, which was sort of causing all that disruption and whatever. Probably today the same thing's happening now in the Middle East, in Syria, and so there must be very similar stories for people from the Middle East,
and the same resentment for people who are trying to escape it as well.
Yeah, and previously for people from Eastern European countries, like during the Bosnia conflict and things like that. So it happens everywhere, and it happened in the war probably the same. Polish.
Yeah.
It's the same story, but just a different type of culture, really. Just cultural differences in the actual culture of the particular country.
Yeah, it's so many different stories. How do you boil it down to just one performance?
Well, I think that's the cleverness of the writer. Yeah. She's taken all this research, and Mimi N.W. Sun, she translated the interviews which were conducted in either Cantonese or Mandarin or Hakka, which is another dialect, were then translated into English by Mimi, and then Mary kind of saw the kind of common themes running through several of the stories, and so distilled, and then she's placed those stories with 3 distinct characters. So these stories are told separately, but then you discover that the 3 characters are interrelated in some way, either through marriage, or one, as I say, Mei Lan is the goddaughter of Cheng Wing. Yi Di marries somebody who's connected to Cheng Wing. So, the stories all come together towards the end, which is, but during the course of the play, we hear the stories separately. They all arrive in this restaurant to give an interview. So the writers kind of, one of the reasons they're setting it in Chinese restaurants, and you asked about Manchester, why doing it in Manchester rather than opening it in Leeds? Well, we did open it in Leeds 2 years ago, but actually the stories, from our experience of playing around the country, general audiences, whether you're white, black, South Asian, whatever, LGBT, it doesn't matter. Everybody has responded really positively, saying they were moved, they were entertained, they laughed, they cried, the stories are universal, and they found the pieces very authentic. But for the Chinese community in particular, who've come to watch, they said, this is the first time I've seen my story reflected authentically on stage. And I think that says an incredible amount in terms of the credit to the lead writer and the associate writer, that they've done that research. It's come from a real place, rather than just people who've Googled and read Chinese stories, and then you end up with slightly
Orientalism.
Slightly not very fully fleshed characters. But here, the stories have come from proper research over a lengthy period, and therefore the characters are very real, and that's what the play speaks to. And therefore, it doesn't matter where you show the show and where you open it. It's actually relevant anywhere in the country, but it's about arriving in the UK.
Yeah, and you're performing it in restaurants. When you're in Manchester, you're in one of the most famous Chinese restaurants in the north of England, in fact, the Yang Sing. And some of these restaurants, you're just doing one-off performances here and there. Like when you're in Lancaster, you're moving around. That must be quite a challenge to move around and to set up and perform in that kind of non-theatre space, is it?
We wait and see.
Well, it's my job as the director
to
ensure that the company feels safe, and that we rehearse sufficiently so that they own the space. And we have an events manager who will help plan the seating along with Sabina. Sinman is our events manager, and she's working alongside Sabina, our stage manager. So they will work in advance to plan the layout of each space we go to. So we're mostly playing in restaurants. We also play in some community centres for the Chinese OAPs, and also into some of the Chinese schools for British Chinese teenagers to also have an experience of theatre with a 7-strong British Chinese cast.
So I think that the way we're blocking it and everything is basically so that it's adaptable. We're trying to make it as adaptable as possible. David is trying to visualise it as adaptable as possible, because some of the venues are larger than the others, some of them are smaller, some of them are going to be a bit more cramped. But obviously, if they're a little bit more cramped, it's going to be a lot more intimate. So you it's going to be intimate anyway, because it's in a restaurant, and it's not in a huge auditorium. So, but two of the places may be a little bit bigger than a restaurant might be, but
presumably your audience won't be in darkness, either, like in a theatre.
No, so that we will have theatre lighting from some of the birdcage structures that we'll have 6 of these dotted around the space, and we'll be hanging theatre lights on those and uplighting the actors so that it doesn't shine into the audience's faces when they're watching. But it's very much an immersive experience. So food is served. So when they first arrive, they're served a bowl of soup. And during the course of the play, soup is a recurring theme that young Cheng Wing, when he loses his mother at the tender age of 8, he's always dreaming of mother's soup. Amongst Cantonese families, soup making takes hours. You cook the soup, and it's a very traditional thing.
It's a work of art.
Yeah. It's a work of art, and it's absolutely delicious, but it takes hours, and so therefore it's the real expression of mother's love.
Yes. Every vegetable has a certain meaning.
Yes.
So it's drama, culture, with a meal thrown in.
Yes.
What more can you get?
Yeah,
absolutely.
Sold it to me. Yes.
And hopefully entertainment. So
yes. So people arrive, they get a bowl of soup. There's some music, it's music and singing from the ensemble as waiters, and then the three main characters arrive as if they're going to give an interview in the restaurant. And the ensemble of waiters are curious to, what's going on? And so they want to join in, they playfully join in. And therefore there's a kind of slightly Brechtian thing where they're putting on a jacket or a hat or whatever above their basic black and white waiter's uniform. And they're playing the characters told in the stories of the three main characters. So they're enacting out. And then the three main characters are remembering and storytelling. And that's how the piece evolves.
So when you did this a couple of years ago, did you find that the audience are more interactive than when you plunge them into darkness into an auditorium?
Not necessarily, because 2 years ago we played it end on. We had a slightly different older actor then who hadn't done theatre for a while, so we decided to try and make the staging as simple as possible. So we played it end on last time, and it was with some Chinese screens, and then everybody was hidden behind there, including props and costume and all these frantic quick changes, because there's a lot of doubling in the show. So it was played end on, and people would, we put the tables and chairs in a sort of semicircle around.
Shape,
but this time, because it's our second chance to revisit, we're trying to go for a slightly more ambitious, and also we have a much more experienced theatre actor in Ozzie.
Speak for yourself.
So we decided to stage it in the round, which is actually harder to do in many ways. But I think when we first did the workshop version of this, before we did the tour, that's what we first did, was in the round, and the producers preferred that version. And so therefore, I, as a director, I was keen to actually try it and make sure that we could do that in every venue we went to. So that's been the big challenge now, is how to deal with a multitude of costumes and props with a minimalist set that still looks sort of aesthetically pleasing and is playful, and in which the company of 7 actors and 1 composer musician can sit comfortably amongst the audience.
As
time,
David said 2 years ago, David was initially involved in it, and I wasn't. Although I knew about the piece at the time, I think I was doing something else somewhere or other, I can't remember. And I never actually got to see it, and so I'm visiting it for the first time, really.
Has the script changed at all since the last time you did it?
The prologue has. So the previous version, the 3 main characters were introduced gradually. So soup was served, then Old Cheng-ming comes in, there's a little vignette of him interacting with the waitress, then he leaves, then more music was played, then the second character, etc. So they came in and out. But I think from the feedback and also on reflection, Mary thought that this version would be stronger with a more definite start. I think the audience last time weren't quite sure, should we stop, stop eating our soup? So I think this version, we're just going to have 15 minutes of...
This version sort of introduces the main 3 characters sort of, in the first scene, really.
Yeah, all at once.
All at once.
Yeah.
And the play begins. It's a definite beginning rather than do we stop to... And then... No, the music's playing, so we have our soup. Should we stop now? I think audience's feedback plus the writer reflecting on it was fine, but I think this is it's a better beginning. But that's the only change. I mean, there are sort of minor little things in terms of the kind of soup that basically they wrote mangosteen and vegetable soup. And I can't remember from 2 years ago what the Chinese translation was for that. So then I asked the cast, what is a cooling soup? Because the Chinese traditional Chinese medicine believes in, hot, cold, all these opposites. And old Chong says the soup that he gives Mei Lan is good for her temper. So i.e. he's saying she's too hot from a Chinese medicine point of view, and food is used in a medicinal way in Chinese culture. So he's giving her a cooling soup. So I said to the company, what collectively, amongst our collective Chinese consciousness, for those who have traditional mothers, what is a cooling soup? And then somebody said winter melon soup. And I remember that also my mother would say, Dong Gua Tong is very... So there's also a slight element of bilingualism. Trilingualism, actually. The play is mostly English.
English, Cantonese and Mandarin. But it's not going to be one of those things you're not going to understand. You'll know what's happening. From the way the Chinese is delivered. You know what you hopefully will get the gist of what's going on. Even if you don't... for instance, myself, I was born here, and I don't speak Chinese as such, although I can understand a certain amount, a little bit. And my father was Cantonese, and my father was a Chinese interpreter. He was the official Chinese interpreter for Great Britain when he was alive.
Really?
And he got an MBE from the Queen for it and everything. And my father didn't speak Chinese at home because he was always speaking English. My mother, who passed away when I was very small, her father was a Chinese interpreter as well. So she was half Chinese and half Welsh, would you believe? And so I've got a mixed background to some extent. So although before I went to school up until I was about 5 years of age, I did speak a certain amount of Cantonese, but not a lot, just little phrases and things like that. As soon as I went to school, went mixed with English. I was the only Chinese child in the infant school, and out of the window.
And so it's interesting, like Ozzie is the oldest member of the company, but doesn't have the Chinese, and he's been learning it from younger members. So it's the complete opposite of what you would normally expect. You normally expect, it's the old generation whose English is not so good, and blah blah blah, and the younger generation, the English better. But actually, in this instance, it's the opposite. So we're teaching him Chinese, right? And so it's just phrases like Puyong Go Hoi, which is from shore to shore. And, in the script, it was originally written Puyang Go Hai, which is more the Mandarin.
Puyang Go Hai.
Which is more Mandarin.
Right.
So Puyong Go Hoi.
Puyang Go Hoi is the Cantonese version.
So, and it's just getting things like that, because obviously Chong has a more Cantonese background.
When I initially got the script, I had the Chinese elements, so I thought I'll go around the corner to my local takeaway and speak to the young girl there and say, "Can you?" And I just put the Chinese in front of her and asked her to say, speak. Right. This is the big thing about Chinese language. So I came back and I played it to David, and he said, "Oh, take no notice of that. Take no." It's Cantonese, but it's not. It's Hakka, which is a different dialect of Cantonese. Hakka is a dialect that comes from the New Territories Chinese in Hong Kong. Hong Kong Island is the island, and then on the mainland is that stretch between Hong Kong, Kowloon, and the main border.
Right.
And that all those territories, which was like the sort of rural territories. It's probably the same as St. Helens.
Yes.
It's like same thing.
Yeah.
Hakka is just slightly different dialect of Cantonese.
Yeah.
And that happens all around. My father was from Canton, and he was from the 4th District Canton, which is Siap, Siap is a slightly different dialect again.
Yeah.
This is why my father was an interpreter, because he was able to speak Hakka, he was able to speak Cantonese, Mandarin, and Shanghainese he could speak, because he went to a school in China before he came over here, like a sort of a boarding school to some extent, and a lot of different children from different times. And during the war, he managed the Chinese Seamen's Hostel, so he got Chinese seamen coming in Liverpool.
Yeah.
All during the war, all Chinese seamen coming in from different parts, and he was able to work on conversing with them. So he ended up speaking Hokkien, which is the dialect people speak in Singapore and Malaysia. So he was able to develop his skills.
Yeah.
So the writer's intentions to have things other than English is just to acknowledge and honour the language in which some of these interviewees were interviewed. Yeah. So whether it's Cantonese, Hakka, or...
It's always interesting sometimes if you go to see a play by an Asian company or a Chinese company or something like that, and there's a bit that a certain section of the audience is laughing at and the rest of them don't understand. So might there be one or two lines that the Chinese speakers might pick up on more?
It's like the Mandarin and Cantonese for saying thank you. Mandarin is xie,
yeah,
and Cantonese is doje. So it's different.
Yeah.
So there might be the odd joke that it depends how accurate the pronunciation is. So we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah. I'd probably just pronounce those two things completely different from other people might do.
So you've both been involved in theatre for a long time, and Ozzie, you've been in music for a long time as well.
Yeah.
How have you found things have changed as Chinese actors over the past 20, 30, 50 years even? Has it changed the scene as a Chinese actor?
Well, I started sort of in the 80s, wandering up here to Granada, and started doing sort of extra work and playing sort of Chinese coolies and Sherlock Holmes and things like that, and all sorts of things like that, which was then, but as things went on, I think the fact that I was born in Liverpool and I had a slight Scouse accent as well, it was a little bit quirky as well. So for me, it gave me the opportunity to come away from the Chinese a little bit. Yeah. Although sometimes people would find it peculiar that like the takeaway. It still used to get the takeaway, the waiter, the triad, all those things. But things that, although nowadays the parts that are similar, you do get loads of Chinese tongue and triad parts and Chinese waiters and things like that. You notice now in the castings that there are a lot more professional people who are being cast as Chinese or Asian or Southeast Asian, whichever way we want to call it now, as opposed to the old term of Oriental.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's you see that there's accountants, lawyers, being a lot of police with Chinese heritage or Southeast Asian heritage.
I think things have definitely changed. Because I've been in this industry as an actor. I'm an actor, writer, director. I've been doing it for 30 years, and similar to Ozzie at the beginning, when you leave drama school, a lot of those roles are very stereotypical. And I just thought, this is not the reason why I did 3 years of Shakespeare, and modern contemporary work and all the variety of work that one does at drama school. And I haven't come out to play these rather racist tropes. So I actually turned down certain jobs. I remember turning down a job very early in my career because I thought, for a Chinese waiter, which undoubtedly exists, but this elderly white director wanted it to be very Oriental. I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, very inscrutable. And then he also wanted it to sound very Chinese. So I gave him an authentic Chinese accent, because my brother has a Chinese accent because he was older when he came into this country. And he said, no, it needs to be much, much stronger than that. So I gave him what I thought was a Charlie Chan as a kind of piss take. And he said, that's perfect. And so I turned down that job because I said it was set in Birmingham. I said, could I just do a Brummie accent? No, it had to be this OTT cod Chinese accent, and it had to be very inscrutable. And I just thought, I know far more Chinese people than you do, mate, and none of them are inscrutable. All of them are rich, complex people. So I think it's that.
That's it, they used to expect you to come out and go hot.
So I think that's what's changed, and I think as a consequence, I set up Yellow Earth Theatre, which has been going for 24 years. I ran it for the first 13, now run by Kumiko Mendel, doing a great job, and she's empowering British East Asian writers to find their own voice, and it's given lots of East Asian actors over the years opportunity. Benedict Wong one of his first theatre plays was in the Yellowworth show.
Right.
And, you know, almost every East Asian actor under the sun British East Asian has worked with Yellowworth at some point. And it's kind of been a platform to enable the community and actors to play roles which are non-stereotypical and to play complex roles. And, you know, the company now is really concentrating on new writers. So the more experience and quality work they do, the more variety of stories we'll get, you know.
Benny was, Manchester, you know. Benedict, like me, he used to get some Manchester type accent work as well. And I've known Benedict for a while. I did Marco Polo with him a couple of years ago. He's sort of flown the flag a little bit. Yeah. And for one period, sort of in the 90s and that, I spent a good few years on the equity committee and the what used to be called the Afro-Caribbean and Asian committee, which is now the ethnic committee on. Daniel York is taking that mantle now of fighting for the Chinese side of things, and he's doing a fair amount of work on that basis as well.
I think there's a whole community
trying to get.
I think there's a whole movement now.
Yeah.
I think when Yellowworth was starting, I remember there was something called the Eclipse Report from the Arts Council to look at British theatre as being institutionally racist. And I remember at that conference I was the only British Chinese speaker there. Nobody else, everybody else was white, black or South Asian, that was it. And now 10 years later, that was 2001, and in 2011 there was a campaign about the casting of a particular show that was supposedly Chinese, but only had 3 East Asian actors in a cast of 17. So there was a big protest organised by a group of people, and now there's a whole movement. And I think the British East Asian community, British Chinese and East Asian community, is much more vocal about, that whitewashing is not acceptable. There was a play on at the Print Room in which, again, 5 Chinese characters, and they were all played by white people. So I think in the same way that the black and the South Asian community, the LGBT, the disabled community have all spoken up and asserted their right to be heard, I think our community is collectively much more assertive, much more confident now to say what is and is not acceptable.
You see, the Chinese tradition has always been to sort of has been like as like a humble type of character, really, and so they've not really been the same way as Afro-Caribbean and Asian have been, speaking out. And I spent a good time when I was working in equity in trying as much as possible to stop casting directors from having that tunnel vision. When they're casting, that's one of the main things I used to hate. It was like the way they would,
But things have really changed. Things have really improved, and it's partly also, largely I would say, it's due to the rise of China, because China has become the second most powerful economy in the world. Commercial producers, particularly those working in film, television, they can't ignore that.
No.
So both Winston and I had an audition for a big Hollywood thing recently. Originally it was written for an Ecuadorian, and then suddenly the casting has changed and they want the pilot to be Chinese. So, they want a share of that global market, which is huge.
Yes.
The Chinese market, if a film does well in China, it's going to earn far more than it does in the States, because it's 1.4 billion people, nearly 1.5, I think. So, compared to in America, is 0.35 billion, whatever, So it's less than a billion in the States. So you just can't compare. You add the population of America and Europe together, China's still got a bigger market. So I think there are real commercial considerations. Consequently, the roles have got better for British, Chinese and East Asian actors. There are more of them, and I think that's finally our time has come. The black and the South Asian community, LGBT, disabled, they're all quite integrated now. There are famous actors from those communities that one can call to mind. But from the East Asian one, the British Chinese one, other than Gemma Chan from Crazy Rich Asians and Benedict Wong from various films in Hollywood, from Doctor Strange and so on, there aren't any others of that generation, of the younger generation. But I think that's changing.
Yeah.
And I think that's all for the good. And it contributes to better understanding of each other's humanity. It's when people don't listen to each other. We have Brexit and we have Trump. But when we listen to each other, when we listen to the common humanity we all share, then we don't want to put up too many walls. We want to build bridges. And I think that's what the power of theatre is.
Yes, like I did something in Berlin in a Netflix series called Counterpart. And the part I played wasn't really a stereotype Chinese part. It could have been played by a German. It could have been. I was just running a retreat, a cottage, like a complex of retreats. Running cottages, and it could have been in sort of supposedly in sort of Cold War Berlin, which in the old days would have been played by somebody else, not a Chinese person. But they decided to cast a Chinese person in it.
Yeah, and more and more British East Asian artists, writers, directors, actors, a lot of them are generating their own work as well. So the more variety, the better.
Yeah.
And as I say, the arts is a great open-gestured beast being. It should be one that is inclusive and embraces the richness and the diversity of what this country is, and come and see From Shore to Shore, because I think that's hopefully what this particular piece is too. It's about celebrating our common humanity.
From Shore to Shore, directed by David K S Tse for On the Wire and starring Ozzie Yue, will open at the Yang Sing restaurant in Manchester from the 9th to the 16th of March and will then tour until the 6th of April, with performances in Liverpool, Lancaster, Morecambe, Newcastle upon Tyne and Birmingham. For more information, see www.fromshoretoshore.co.uk. You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.